Sometimes the most dangerous thing a black woman can do in America is look like she belongs. The smell of smoked ribs and charcoal drifted through the quiet suburban street like a warm summer memory, mixing with the distant sound of old-school soul music and children laughing somewhere near the sidewalk. And for most people on Maplewood Drive, it should have felt normal, harmless even. Just another Saturday evening in a neighborhood where trimmed lawns stretched neatly beneath glowing porch lights and American flags swayed gently in the humid Georgia air, but from behind the second-floor curtains of a pale yellow house across the street, Karen Whitmore stood frozen with narrowed eyes and crossed arms, staring at the gathering in Danielle Brooks' backyard as if she were witnessing something suspicious instead of families sharing food beneath strings of hanging lights. Because in Karen's mind, something about the scene felt wrong, though she couldn't fully explain why. Maybe it was the music playing slightly louder than what the neighborhood was used to. Maybe it was the line of parked cars stretching farther down the curb than usual. Or maybe it was simply the sight of too many black faces gathered comfortably in a space Karen subconsciously believed was never meant for them. And the more she watched, the tighter her jaw became, especially when she noticed Danielle standing near the grill wearing a simple navy blouse and jeans, calmly turning burgers while smiling at a little girl holding a paper plate almost too big for her hands. Because Danielle didn't look nervous, she didn't look apologetic, she looked like someone completely at home. And for Karen, that confidence felt almost offensive. This neighborhood used to be quiet, she muttered under her breath while pulling out her phone, her voice carrying the bitter frustration of someone who believed the world was changing without her permission. Outside, the golden light of sunset reflected softly against Danielle's backyard fence, while guests moved comfortably between folding tables covered in potato salad, cornbread, baked beans, and red plastic cups sweating in the summer heat. A few older men laughed near the smoker while children chased each other through the grass with sparklers left over from last weekend's 4th of July celebration. And through it all, Danielle remained calm, composed, almost graceful in the way she carried herself, occasionally adjusting the sleeves of her blouse while checking on guests like someone who had spent her entire life learning how to make others feel safe. But across the street, Karen's breathing had already grown shallow with irritation as she zoomed in with her phone camera, recording clips through the blinds while narrating under her breath, like she was collecting evidence for a crime nobody else could see. "There's at least 30 people over there now," she whispered sharply. "Cars everywhere, loud music, who knows what's really going on?" And despite the peaceful atmosphere outside, the story inside Karen's head was becoming darker by the second. Because prejudice rarely announces itself honestly. It disguises itself as concern, as caution, as someone simply trying to protect the neighborhood. And after another long stare through the window, Karen finally pressed the call button, her fingers tapping impatiently against the phone as she waited for dispatch to answer. Then in a lowered voice meant to sound reasonable, she said the words that would change the entire evening. "Hi. Yes. I'd like to report suspicious activity on Maplewood Drive. There's a large gathering here, and honestly, I don't feel safe." The evening air settled heavily over Maplewood Drive as the sun disappeared behind rows of identical rooftops, leaving the neighborhood washed in the amber glow of porch lights and fading summer heat. And while laughter still drifted softly from Danielle Brooks' backyard, there was now a tension moving quietly beneath the surface like a storm building somewhere far away. Because several houses down the street, curtains had begun to shift. Front doors cracked open slightly, and neighbors who usually minded their own business suddenly found reasons to stand outside checking mailboxes that did not need checking or watering plants that were already soaked from the afternoon rain, all while stealing glances toward Danielle's home with the same uneasy curiosity that spreads whenever someone decides a person no longer belongs. And none of them noticed how carefully Danielle moved through the crowd, greeting guests by name, refilling drinks, helping an elderly man adjust his folding chair near the patio, because her calmness made it impossible to read what kind of woman she really was. There was no arrogance in her posture, no attempt to impress anyone, only quiet confidence shaped by years of discipline, the kind that does not need attention to feel powerful. Near the grill, a teenage boy accidentally dropped a tray of hamburger buns onto the grass and immediately panicked. But Danielle simply smiled and handed him another bag from the cooler beside her. "Do not worry about it," she told him gently. Nobody remembers the perfect barbecue. They remember how people made them feel. And the guests around her laughed softly as the tension briefly disappeared again beneath the warm rhythm of music and conversation. But across the street, Karen Whitmore stood on her porch now, no longer hiding behind the curtains, her phone clutched tightly in one hand while she stared openly at the gathering with narrowed eyes. And beside her another neighbor, Greg Patterson, shifted awkwardly in sandals and a wrinkled polo shirt, unsure whether he truly agreed with her or simply did not want to argue. "I mean, it is just a cookout," he muttered quietly, but Karen shook her head immediately. "You are not paying attention," she whispered sharply. "People do not just move into neighborhoods like this and throw parties that big on their first month here." Greg glanced again toward Danielle's yard where children were now chasing bubbles through the grass, while an older woman danced slowly beside the picnic tables. And for a second, he looked almost embarrassed by the conversation. But Karen had already convinced herself she was witnessing something dangerous, because prejudice often grows strongest in silence, feeding itself with assumptions until fear begins to sound reasonable. And when the distant sound of sirens finally echoed faintly through the neighborhood, Karen straightened almost proudly, her lips tightening into satisfaction as red and blue lights reflected softly against parked cars and trimmed hedges. Meanwhile, Danielle remained near the grill turning smoked chicken with slow, deliberate movements, while one of her guests leaned closer and quietly asked, "Do you want us to stop the music?" But Danielle barely looked up as she brushed seasoning onto the meat and answered calmly, "No, let them come." And something about the way she said it made the people around her suddenly quiet, not fearful, not nervous, just aware that Danielle Brooks did not sound like someone worried about police officers arriving at her door. She sounded like someone who already knew exactly what would happen next. The flashing red and blue lights rolled slowly across Maplewood Drive like waves of tension washing over the neighborhood, reflecting against polished SUVs, trimmed hedges, and wide front windows where curious faces now watched openly, without pretending anymore. And the moment the patrol vehicle stopped in front of Danielle Brooks' house, the entire atmosphere shifted, conversations faded, children stopped running. And even the music playing softly from the backyard seemed quieter beneath the weight of expectation, because everyone on the street suddenly understood they were about to witness something. The kind of public moment people later replay in their minds differently, depending on which side of it they stood. Karen Whitmore stepped forward immediately before the officers could even close their car doors, her expression sharp with self-importance as she pointed toward Danielle's backyard with the confidence of someone expecting gratitude for making the call. "Officer, thank goodness you are here," she said loudly enough for nearby neighbors to hear. "This has been going on for hours now. There are too many people, too many cars, loud music, and honestly I have no idea who these people are." Officer Ryan Keller adjusted his duty belt while scanning the street carefully, his face unreadable beneath the glow of the cruiser lights. Beside him, Officer Miguel Torres glanced toward the backyard, where smoke from the grill drifted lazily into the humid evening air, carrying the scent of barbecue sauce and hickory seasoning. And for a second, neither officer moved because what they saw did not resemble chaos or danger. It looked like families eating dinner together under string lights. But Karen continued speaking before silence could settle. "I tried to be patient," she insisted. "But this neighborhood has standards and people are starting to feel uncomfortable." The word uncomfortable lingered heavily in the air because everyone understood what she truly meant even if she refused to say it directly. A few neighbors standing nearby exchanged uneasy glances while others quietly nodded along, not wanting to challenge her out loud. And from the backyard, Danielle finally looked up from the grill after hearing the sirens stop outside her home, her face calm, composed, almost detached from the tension surrounding her. She handed a plate of ribs to an older guest sitting near the patio before wiping her hands slowly with a white towel. And while several people at the barbecue began whispering nervously, Danielle showed no sign of panic at all. She simply placed the towel beside the grill and started walking toward the front yard with the same steady posture she had carried all evening, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes focused, and something about the way she moved made the officers stand a little straighter without even realizing it. Meanwhile, Karen folded her arms tightly as Danielle approached, almost daring her to argue. "This is exactly the problem," Karen muttered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Nobody respects the rules anymore. But Danielle stopped several feet away without raising her voice or showing irritation, the porch light casting a warm glow against her face while distant cicadas hummed through the trees. And in that quiet moment, the entire street seemed to pause, waiting to see how she would respond. Because humiliation has a rhythm to it, especially when people believe they have authority on their side. But Danielle only looked calmly between the officers and Karen before speaking in a voice so controlled it almost disarmed the tension itself. "If someone believed there was danger here," she said softly, "then I understand why you came." Karen let out a short breath of satisfaction, as if the words were an admission of guilt, but Danielle was not finished, her eyes briefly lifting toward the patrol car lights flashing across the neighborhood before returning to the officers standing in front of her. "I just hope," she added quietly, "that everyone here leaves tonight understanding the difference between feeling uncomfortable and actually being unsafe." For several long seconds, nobody spoke after Danielle Brooks finished her sentence, the humid night air hanging heavy between the glowing patrol lights and the smell of barbecue smoke drifting slowly above the quiet street. And Karen Whitmore's expression tightened with irritation because the conversation was not unfolding the way she imagined it would. There was supposed to be authority, confrontation, maybe embarrassment, but instead the woman standing in front of the officers looked completely unshaken, as though this entire moment had already played out in her mind long before any sirens reached Maplewood Drive. Officer Ryan Keller cleared his throat softly while glancing past Danielle toward the backyard, where guests now stood silently near folding tables watching from a distance. Nobody looked threatening. Nobody looked disorderly. They looked uncomfortable, aware that they had suddenly become the center of suspicion for simply existing too loudly in the wrong neighborhood. Karen stepped closer before the officers could respond. "You need to check what is going on back there," she insisted, her voice carrying sharper now under the attention of the crowd gathering nearby. "There are strangers everywhere, and nobody even knows who she is." The final sentence landed differently than she intended because several neighbors, standing behind her, slowly exchanged looks of discomfort, especially after realizing they themselves had never introduced themselves to Danielle since she moved in 3 weeks earlier. They had watched her unload moving boxes, watched landscapers trim her yard, watched expensive furniture arrive in delivery trucks. But nobody had ever walked across the street to say welcome. And now suddenly they were acting as if her presence required explanation. Danielle noticed it too, though her expression never changed. She simply folded the white towel neatly over one arm and looked toward the officers with calm patience, while music from the backyard continued softly behind her. An old Marvin Gaye song floating through the warm Georgia evening like a reminder of a world gentler than the one standing in front of her. Now, Officer Miguel Torres finally stepped forward slightly and asked in a respectful tone, "Ma'am, we received a call about possible disturbance concerns. Do you mind if we ask how long the event is expected to continue tonight?" Karen nodded immediately as if the question confirmed her fears, but Danielle answered without hesitation. "Probably another hour or two," she said calmly. "Families are finishing dinner, and some of the kids are waiting for dessert." Then after a brief pause, she added quietly, "I made peach cobbler." And for the first time all night, Officer Miguel almost smiled before quickly composing himself again, because something about Danielle's calmness was beginning to change the atmosphere around them. The tension no longer pointed toward her. It was slowly turning back toward the people who called the police in the first place. But Karen was too frustrated to notice the shift happening beneath the surface. She folded her arms tighter and lowered her voice just enough to sound confidential, while still making sure nearby neighbors could hear her. "Officer, with all due respect, people in this neighborhood are worried," she said carefully. "This street has always been quiet until now." Danielle looked directly at her then, not angry, not offended, simply observant, as if she had heard versions of that sentence her entire life in different cities spoken by different people hiding the same discomfort beneath different words. And before anyone else could speak, a little girl from the backyard suddenly ran up beside Danielle, holding a paper plate with a slice of peach cobbler balanced carefully in both hands. "Miss Brooks," the child asked innocently, "do the police officers want dessert too?" The question landed over the street like unexpected sunlight breaking through clouds, And for a moment, even Officer Ryan looked caught off guard as several guests near the patio quietly laughed under their breath. Danielle glanced down warmly at the little girl before answering softly, "Maybe later." Then she lifted her eyes back toward the officers standing beneath the flashing cruiser lights. And something in her gaze caused Officer Ryan's expression to subtly change. Not fear, not confusion. Recognition, faint at first, but growing stronger with every second. He looked at her face beneath the porch light, because suddenly the woman standing in front of him no longer looked like a random homeowner hosting a neighborhood barbecue. She looked familiar. Officer Ryan Keller stared at Danielle Brooks for another second longer than necessary, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to pull a memory from somewhere buried beneath routine patrol shifts and endless department briefings. And around them, Maplewood Drive had fallen almost completely silent now, except for the low hum of cicadas and the soft crackle of charcoal burning in the grill behind Danielle's house, because everyone standing nearby could feel something shifting even if they did not yet understand what it was. Karen Whitmore certainly did not notice it. Her attention remained fixed on winning the moment she believed she had created. "This is not personal," she said quickly while gesturing toward the backyard again. "But there are rules in neighborhoods like this, and people expect a certain level of order." The phrase "neighborhoods like this" landed awkwardly in the air, heavier than she intended. And this time, even Greg Patterson looked uncomfortable enough to step half a pace away from her on the sidewalk. Meanwhile, Danielle remained perfectly composed beneath the porch light, one hand resting loosely against the folded towel, while the other held the paper plate the little girl had left behind moments earlier. And despite the dozens of eyes watching her, she carried herself with the calm control of someone long accustomed to being judged before speaking. "Order matters," Danielle replied softly after a pause. "But so does perspective." Her voice never rose above conversation level, yet somehow everyone on the street heard every word clearly. Officer Miguel glanced briefly toward Ryan, as if silently asking whether he recognized her too, because now that the thought had entered his mind, he could not shake it either. There was something about Danielle's posture, the measured way she spoke, even the subtle authority in her stillness that felt deeply familiar. But before either officer could say anything, Karen interrupted again, frustration sharpening her voice now that the scene was slipping away from her control. "Officer, are you seriously telling me this is normal?" she demanded. Cars lining the street, loud music, strangers everywhere, and nobody knows who this woman even is. Danielle's eyes shifted toward Karen then, not defensive, not angry, simply steady. And for the first time all evening, Karen seemed unsettled by the directness of her gaze, because there was no fear in it at all. None of the nervousness she expected from someone standing under police scrutiny in front of an entire neighborhood. Only patience, almost as though Danielle understood something nobody else did yet. Then slowly Danielle looked back toward Officer Ryan and asked calmly, "How long have you been with the department?" The question caught him off guard enough that he blinked once before answering. "About 6 years, ma'am." Danielle nodded faintly as though confirming a thought in her mind. "Then this must be your first month under the new administration," she said quietly. And the moment the words left her mouth, something changed visibly in Ryan's expression, a flicker of realization passing across his face so quickly most people missed it. But Officer Miguel saw it immediately and turned toward Danielle with sudden attention, because earlier that week the department had circulated internal announcements, emails, photographs, transition schedules, mandatory leadership meetings, all centered around one name, one face, one incoming figure every officer in the city had been discussing for days. And now, standing beneath the warm porch light, with barbecue smoke drifting through the Georgia night, Officer Ryan finally understood why the woman in front of him looked familiar. His posture straightened instinctively, while Karen continued speaking beside him, completely unaware of the shift happening inches away. "Honestly, officer, somebody needed to say something before this neighborhood turns into—" She stopped herself mid-sentence. But it was already too late, because silence had fallen across the street again. And this time it was not anticipation, it was realization slowly spreading across the faces of the officers standing in front of Danielle Brooks. Karen Whitmore's unfinished sentence dissolved into the humid night air as Officer Ryan Keller slowly removed his cap, and the movement alone was enough to change the energy of the entire street. because moments earlier he had stood there like a responding officer handling a neighborhood complaint. But now his posture carried something completely different: respect, the kind that cannot be faked once recognition settles in. Beside him, Officer Miguel Torres straightened immediately as realization fully hit him too. Both men exchanging the brief, silent look shared by people who suddenly understand they are standing in front of someone far more important than anyone around them realizes. And for the first time since calling the police, Karen's confidence visibly cracked. "What is going on?" she asked sharply, her eyes darting between the officers and Danielle Brooks. But nobody answered her right away because the atmosphere on Maplewood Drive had shifted so dramatically that even the guests near the backyard stopped moving entirely. Paper plates frozen in their hands while the red and blue patrol lights flickered softly across faces filled now with confusion instead of suspicion. Danielle remained perfectly still beneath the porch light, one hand resting against the folded towel, while warm smoke from the grill curled gently into the night behind her. And despite everything that had happened, she looked almost unaffected by the attention surrounding her, as though this moment had never been about proving herself at all. Officer Ryan swallowed once before speaking carefully. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "I did not realize." But Danielle interrupted softly before he could finish. "That is usually how these situations begin." Her words were calm, almost reflective rather than angry, and the sentence landed heavily over everyone listening because suddenly the meaning behind the entire evening became impossible to ignore. Karen stepped forward again, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Wait a second," she said quickly. "Nobody told us who she was." But even as the words left her mouth, they sounded smaller than before, weaker somehow, because the problem was becoming painfully obvious now. Nobody had ever asked Danielle who she was before deciding what they assumed about her, and that realization spread silently through the crowd standing along the sidewalks and driveways, some neighbors lowering their eyes while others folded their arms awkwardly, embarrassed by how quickly fear had turned into accusation. Then Officer Miguel finally spoke, his voice steady and formal now. "Chief Brooks," he said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Welcome officially to the district, ma'am." And the moment the title left his mouth, the entire street froze. Karen's face drained of color, while several neighbors looked at Danielle with stunned disbelief, because standing in front of them the entire evening was not some suspicious outsider disrupting the neighborhood, not a stranger bringing danger into their quiet suburb, but the newly appointed chief of police for the entire city, the very person now overseeing the department whose officers had just responded to a complaint against her own backyard barbecue. Silence swept across Maplewood Drive so completely that even the distant music from the patio seemed to disappear beneath it. And in that silence, Danielle Brooks did not smile triumphantly. She did not embarrass anyone. She simply nodded once toward the officers with the same quiet dignity she had carried all night. "Thank you, officers," she replied softly, and somehow her restraint made the moment even heavier, because there was no revenge in her voice, only exhaustion, the kind that comes from understanding exactly how quickly people can mistake black joy for danger, black confidence for threat, and black presence for suspicion. Karen stared at Danielle, speechless now, while Officer Ryan shifted uncomfortably beside the patrol car, visibly aware of how ugly the situation had become. Then Danielle looked slowly around the neighborhood at the watching faces illuminated by porch lights and flashing sirens before speaking one final sentence that settled into the summer night like truth nobody could escape. "Interesting," she said quietly. "How nobody needed my name until the uniform entered the conversation." The silence that followed Officer Miguel Torres calling Danielle Brooks chief felt heavier than the humid Georgia air itself, stretching across Maplewood Drive, while flashing patrol lights painted the quiet suburban street in slow waves of red and blue. And for several long seconds nobody moved, because the entire neighborhood was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of the woman standing beneath that porch light. The first version built from assumptions, whispers, discomfort, and fear, and the second built from reality, authority, discipline, and respect. Karen Whitmore looked stunned in a way pride could not easily hide, her mouth parting slightly as her eyes shifted between Danielle and the officers, as though she expected someone to suddenly explain away the misunderstanding and return the evening to the story she originally believed. But no explanation came, because the truth was already standing in front of everyone wearing jeans, barbecue smoke, and quiet dignity. Danielle slowly unfolded the towel resting over her arm and placed it gently on the porch railing before looking toward the officers again. "I appreciate you responding professionally," she said calmly. And even now her tone carried no bitterness despite the humiliation she had just endured in front of an entire neighborhood. Officer Ryan nodded immediately, his voice more formal now than at any point during the evening. "Of course, Chief Brooks," he replied. "We were not aware this was your residence." But Danielle's eyes softened slightly in a way that almost felt sad instead of offended. "That is exactly the point," she answered quietly, because all night nobody cared whose residence it was until authority entered the conversation. Before that, she had only been a black woman hosting a barbecue in the wrong zip code. And the realization settled visibly over several neighbors standing nearby, some looking down at their driveways while others quietly slipped back toward their front porches, hoping to disappear before anyone noticed they had been watching too. But Karen remained frozen in place beneath the street lamp, unable to walk away yet equally unable to defend what she had done. "Chief," she finally said awkwardly, forcing the title out now that she knew it mattered. "I did not mean any disrespect. I was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe." Danielle looked at her for a long moment before answering. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained steady and calm enough to make the words hit even harder. "Safe from what?" she asked softly. Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out because for the first time all evening, she was being forced to confront the question honestly. There had been no screaming, no threats, no destruction. Only music, food, laughter, and black families existing comfortably in a neighborhood where some people quietly believed they did not belong. And suddenly that truth felt impossible to escape. A warm breeze moved through the trees overhead, while somewhere behind Danielle's house a child laughed again. The sound small but powerful against the tension hanging over the street. Then Officer Miguel cleared his throat gently and gestured toward the backyard. "Chief Brooks, some of the officers from South Precinct mentioned they were invited tonight for community outreach." Danielle nodded faintly. "That was the plan," she replied. "I wanted the neighborhood to meet the people behind the badges before emergencies forced those introductions." The sentence landed heavily because everyone standing there understood the irony immediately. Tonight had become exactly the opposite of what Danielle intended. Instead of building trust, she had become the target of suspicion before anyone bothered to know her name. And yet somehow she still carried herself with remarkable restraint. No anger, no public humiliation, no attempt to embarrass Karen even after everything. Because real authority does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply stands still while everyone else reveals who they are around it. Then Danielle glanced once more at the silent crowd gathered across lawns and sidewalks before speaking quietly into the summer night. "The hardest part about this job," she said, "is realizing how many people only recognize your humanity after they recognize your title." The tension on Maplewood Drive did not disappear after the truth came out. It simply changed shape, transforming from suspicion into shame so quietly that almost nobody knew where to look anymore. Porch lights glowed across carefully manicured lawns while neighbors who had gathered out of curiosity now stood stiff and silent beside mailboxes and driveways, wishing they had stayed inside their homes instead of watching another human being treated like a threat for hosting a barbecue. And through it all, Danielle Brooks remained remarkably composed beneath the soft yellow porch light. The same woman everyone had doubted only minutes earlier, now carrying herself with the calm authority of someone who had spent years learning how to survive moments exactly like this without letting bitterness consume her. Behind her, the smell of peach cobbler and smoked ribs still drifted gently through the warm summer air, while children resumed whispering quietly near the backyard fence, slowly sensing that whatever danger adults imagined tonight had never truly existed at all. Officer Ryan Keller finally stepped away from the patrol car and spoke carefully. "Chief Brooks, would you like us to clear the area?" But Danielle shook her head almost immediately. "No," she answered softly. "Nobody needs to leave." Her response surprised several people standing nearby, because after the humiliation, the accusations, and the public suspicion directed toward her all evening, most expected anger, consequences, maybe even retaliation. But Danielle did not seem interested in revenge, only truth. And somehow that made the situation feel even heavier for the people now forced to confront themselves honestly. Karen Whitmore looked visibly smaller than before, standing beneath the street lamp with her arms no longer crossed defensively, but hanging awkwardly at her sides, as though certainty itself had abandoned her. She glanced toward the neighbors around her, hoping someone might support her version of events. But nobody spoke because now the entire street understood what had actually happened. A black woman moved into a wealthy neighborhood, hosted a family barbecue, and somebody decided her existence looked suspicious enough to call the police. There was no hidden crime beneath the evening, no danger waiting behind the music or parked cars, only assumptions powerful enough to transform ordinary joy into imagined threat. Danielle slowly stepped down from her porch onto the walkway leading toward the sidewalk, and as she moved, every conversation nearby seemed to stop automatically, not out of fear but respect, because real authority rarely needs to raise its voice to command attention. She looked first toward the officers standing beside the cruiser, and then toward the watching neighbors before speaking calmly into the humid Georgia night. "You know," she said softly, "I accepted this position because I believed communities and law enforcement could trust each other again." A faint breeze moved through the trees overhead, carrying the distant sound of wind chimes from somewhere farther down the block. "But trust becomes impossible," Danielle continued, "when people confuse black presence with criminal suspicion." Nobody interrupted her because there was nothing left to argue against anymore. The evidence of what happened tonight stood plainly in front of everyone. Karen swallowed hard before finally speaking in a voice stripped completely of the confidence she carried earlier. "Chief Brooks, I truly did not know." Danielle turned toward her slowly, and for a second Karen looked almost frightened of what she might hear next, but Danielle's expression remained calm, tired more than angry. "That is the part one hope you remember," she replied quietly. "You should not need to know my title before deciding whether I deserve respect." The sentence settled over Maplewood Drive with painful clarity, because deep down everyone listening understood she was right, and somewhere behind Danielle, a little boy suddenly lifted a fresh tray of burgers from the grill, while another guest turned the music slightly louder again. Soft soul music filling the silence that had dominated the neighborhood all evening. Then Officer Miguel glanced toward Danielle carefully and asked, "Chief, would it be all right if we stayed a few minutes off duty after this call clears?" And for the first time all night, Danielle smiled faintly, not because justice had humiliated someone, but because humanity had finally started to return to the street. The atmosphere on Maplewood Drive slowly transformed as the tension that once clung to the neighborhood gave way to something quieter, heavier, and far more uncomfortable than anger: self-reflection. Because one by one neighbors who had gathered outside to witness what they assumed would become another dramatic police confrontation now stood silently beneath porch lights, realizing they had participated in something far uglier than a noise complaint. And while the flashing patrol lights finally dimmed and Officer Ryan Keller radioed dispatch to clear the call without incident, Danielle Brooks simply turned back toward her backyard as though the evening itself deserved to continue untouched by ignorance. The music rose gently again through the warm Georgia night. Soft soul melodies drifting over folding tables covered in half-eaten peach cobbler, paper plates, and melting cups of sweet tea, while children resumed laughing near the fence line with the resilience only children possess, able to move beyond tension faster than the adults who create it. Officer Miguel Torres loosened his posture beside the cruiser and quietly accepted a plate of barbecue from one of Danielle's guests, while Officer Ryan hesitated for a moment before doing the same, both men suddenly looking less like symbols of authority and more like ordinary people standing inside a lesson neither of them would forget. And somewhere across the street, Karen Whitmore remained frozen near her mailbox, watching the scene continue without her, because perhaps for the first time in years, she truly understood what isolation felt like. Not the kind built from fear, but the kind created when someone realizes their own assumptions have separated them from humanity itself. She glanced around at the neighbors who earlier stood beside her, nodding in agreement, but now most avoided eye contact entirely, embarrassed by how quickly suspicion had spread through the street simply because a black family barbecue looked unfamiliar in a neighborhood accustomed to sameness. And while shame settled quietly over Maplewood Drive, Danielle showed no interest in humiliating anyone further, because dignity had already done what revenge never could. It exposed the truth without raising its voice. She walked slowly back toward the grill, where smoke still curled softly into the night sky, and checked on a tray of chicken wings while guests gradually relaxed again around her. And watching her move through her own backyard with calm confidence felt strangely powerful now to everyone standing nearby, because the entire neighborhood had spent hours treating her like an outsider only to discover she was the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the city. Yet somehow the most important thing about Danielle Brooks had never been her title at all. It was her patience, her restraint, and her refusal to become cruel in response to cruelty. Then, as the evening settled deeper into night, Danielle picked up a fresh pitcher of lemonade from the patio table and noticed Karen still standing alone across the street beneath the dim glow of the street lamp. Their eyes met briefly, and for a moment Karen looked as though she wanted to say something more, perhaps apologize again, perhaps explain herself. But Danielle only gave a small polite nod before turning back toward her guests, because some lessons do not require speeches once the truth becomes impossible to ignore. And as Officer Ryan laughed quietly with an elderly man near the smoker while children carried sparklers through the grass behind them, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, except now the silence felt different, no longer built from suspicion but reflection. And somewhere in the distance, a warm summer breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of charcoal and peach cobbler across Maplewood Drive, while Danielle Brooks stood beneath glowing string lights surrounded by community, dignity, and earned respect, proving something the entire street would remember long after the patrol cars disappeared. That some people only recognize authority when they see a badge, but real character reveals itself long before anyone salutes.